My name is Madhavi Mohan. I am from the University of Western Ontario in Canada. And my talk today is going to be titled Abortion in the US and Birthing People. So as most of you probably have heard, although I am Canadian, so it is kind of funny that I'm doing a presentation on the US, but recently in the US, Roe v. Wade was overturned. And so there was it kind of spelled big reductions in accessibility for abortion providers. When people talk about this as sort of a feminist issue or an issue for women, there's a bit of some people suggest that we should, instead of like couching abortion and reproductive rights related issues as problems concerning women, we should frame them as problems concerning birthing people. And the reason why is that, you know, now most people understand that the term woman generally refers to a gender category, but gender doesn't necessarily track sex-based concerns like reproductive issues. And so there's this question of whether we should sort of like create this new category, birthing people, for people who would be affected by those kinds of issues. And you can kind of see an example of this in the 2022 budget of the US government. There's a little section where they talk about funding that they allocate for reproductive kind of problems. And in that section, there's a sentence where they kind of use the term woman and then shift to birthing people. So in that section, they say, the US has the highest maternal mortality rate among developed nations with an unacceptably high rate for women of color. And then to help end this rate of mortality among birthing people, the budget includes more than $200 million. So this presentation is going to focus on whether it's a good idea to switch from talking about women to talking about birthing people. What are some of the motivations behind doing so? And whether we can sort of make room for those motivations while not actually adopting the new term. So I'm going to argue that we should stick to referring to people who are affected by these issues as women, but then I'll also introduce sort of an account of women that can help mitigate some of the concerns that motivated, adopting this term birthing people. So here's sort of the considerations that are lurking in the background. The main reason people want to switch to using the term birthing people to describe people who are affected by these sorts of reproductive issues is that not everybody who's affected by reproductive oppression identifies as a woman. So for example, trans men would certainly be affected by these abortion legislations, but they don't identify as women. Some cis women, like older women, are probably not going to be affected by these issues to the same degree. Same with some non-binary people and so on. And so there's this concern that using the term woman to describe things like menstruation, abortion, anything that has to do with reproduction really is in some way transphobic. On the other hand, though, there have been one sort of popular argument, mostly in like gender critical circles and conservative places, is that some people think that the term birthing people is sort of objectifying, because what you're basically doing is reducing a whole class of people to something their bodies can do. But then who we are is more than just what our bodies are. I'm not actually going to pursue that line of objection. I do think we should retain the term woman, but the reason why has to do with this second point that I've listed below. So basically, when you think of a lot of institutions that concern things that are going to be relevant to women, like, okay, when you think of institutions like feminist philosophy in general, or the feminist movement, or marches, or women's scholarships, a lot of the reasons these things exist is because they're trying to cater to issues not just specific to gender, but also to sex, or issues that overlap both. So, if you think of Planned Parenthood, it initially started as sort of a women's health clinic, and now it does target a wider audience, but there's a sense in which like abortion is something they're going to be concerned with, and that does affect people who don't identify as women, but also a lot of women. And when you think of things like abortion as just a political issue, it evolved as part of the feminist movement. And if we want to kind of retain this understanding that feminism concerns principally women, then you're either going to be committed to saying abortion is no longer a feminist issue, or it is a women's issue. It's just that it also can affect people who aren't women. That's sort of the idea. So my reason for wanting to retain the term woman is because it's tied very closely to the historical tradition of various institutions and movements. And then if you try to move away from that term, you need to have those sorts of analogous institutions and movements for birthing people. But there isn't such a thing as a birthing people scholarship or a birthing people studies department where you only focus on those types of issues. And in the absence of those things, I think it's just more careful or responsible to still consider them principally women's issues. And so that being said, the focus of this presentation is to show a way of retaining the term woman to describe these things while at the same time remaining trans inclusive. And so that's going to be the plan. Okay. So in particular, there's a couple different common views in the metaphysics of gender as to how we should understand the term woman. The view that I'm advocating for is one called contextualism, where the idea is that the meaning of the term woman is supposed to shift from context to context. And the thing that fixes its actual meaning, I argue, is going to be why we use the term. So for instance, when we think of women's bathrooms, we have to ask ourselves, why do we have women's bathrooms to begin with? And the answer to that question is going to fix who we think should be allowed in a women's bathroom. But the reasons we might have a women's scholarship or a women's health clinic are probably wildly different. And so those different reasons should fix who should be admitted. So sometimes I argue that the term does function as a gender identity, while other times it functions as a socially imposed class. In the metaphysics of gender literature, there's sort of two popular views. There's the gender identity view, and then there's also the view that gender categories are ultimately imposed upon us by others, which is what makes them oppressive. So if you think that, in an ideal world, there wouldn't be gender categories, you would be friendly to the socially imposed class view. And people like Sally Haslanger and others have sort of argued for that position. Now, some people have noticed there's a tension between these two views because if you're a trans woman who just doesn't pass or who isn't acknowledged to be a woman by people around you, then if you adopt this social class view, you might not consider trans women women. And so some people came out with this view called a pluralist view, where they think that woman functions both simultaneously as a gender identity and a socially imposed class. My view is similar, but with contextualism, instead of taking the two to apply at the same time, you take them to sometimes apply at the same time, but in some contexts, only one is kind of treated as more important. And I'll talk about why I sort of prefer contextualism pretty soon. So the basic actual intuition that motivates my preference for contextualism is just that sometimes the way we're classed by others or treated by others just doesn't match our identities. And so the kinds of oppression or privilege we face doesn't track how we identify. For instance, a trans man is just not going to share all the same privileges with a cis man. Trans men are prone to greater degrees of sexual violence than cis men, for instance. And so even though they identify as men, and it would make sense to say that their gender identities are men, there are certain contexts where the way they're classed should matter more in how we, in our considerations as to whether to include them in some sort of woman-only space. And I'll be articulating that point in more detail in a second. So in the interest of time, I probably won't read through this, but this basically summarizes the state of the literature as what I was talking about earlier. So Katherine Jenkins is a proponent of the pluralist view, which once again just holds that gender is simultaneously an identity and a class. Diaz-Leon, on the other hand, defends a contextualist view, which basically holds that the meaning will shift from context to context. And then Haslanger's view is sort of representative of that social class view, which I think is talked about less on the ground. So I thought I'd include it. Okay, so my preference for the contextualist view actually came from a quote. And I know this is like a giant wall of text, but it's really important, especially the wording. So I wanted to include it. But my preference for this view was motivated by some comments that Jenkins made in her paper. So Katherine Jenkins argues for a pluralist view. And these are sort of her reasons why. But when I read through this, I thought it supported a contextualist view more. So here's how the quote goes. Jenkins was basically organizing a woman-only march against sexual violence. And she notes that the reason it had to stay women only is because of the symbolic value of conspicuously violating the social norm that a woman ought to be accompanied by a man when walking after dark. In addition to that, she doesn't say this, but there are many other reasons you might want to keep it woman only. Like another reason is that if it's a march against sexual violence, people are going to have an easier time building solidarity if they don't feel like they're being watched by somebody who's part of a social class that's statistically more likely to be sexually violent. So I think she's right in wanting to keep this woman only. But then she raises this question, who counts as a woman for this purpose? She said that for sure they wanted to include trans women, but also they wanted to include people who did not identify as women, but who were in a very real sense targets for the kind of violence and threat of violence against which our protest was directed. So in particular, she had in mind non-binary people and trans men, because even though they might not identify as women, they are often treated as women to the extent that they're more likely to experience sexual violence. If a person sees a trans man, sees them as a woman, they're still more likely to be sexually violent towards them, even if they don't identify as a man. And so this particular example, I thought actually supported contextualism over pluralism. Because if you look at what's happening with the trans man case, we are still considering this a women's march. And so in response to her question, who counts as a woman for this purpose? It seems like part of that answer is trans men, but only for this purpose. Because the sense in which woman is being used for the march here isn't one that is, it's not one that corresponds to how we tend to use it all the time. It's one that's supposed to pick out people who are at risk of sexual violence because of how they're classed effectively. And so it seems like what's happening in this scenario is that the sense of woman as a social class is being prioritized over the sense of woman as a gender identity. And it just so happens that trans women, cis women, and trans men, and some non-binary people are all prone to greater sexual violence in virtue of being classed a certain way. So that's sort of the main example that motivates this whole view. And so this sort of just summarizes what I've mentioned here. That being said, when they choose to admit trans men to a women-only march, it seems unintuitive to say they're being trans exclusionary. Like, it doesn't seem like we could say to Jenkins, oh, shame on you for allowing trans men to participate in this march that does affect them. The reason why I think this shouldn't be considered trans exclusionary is that if you adopt a contextualist view, woman can mean something different and closer to gender identities in other contexts, especially in contexts in which gender identities are just going to matter more. That being said, I think that if we couple the contextualist view with something called essentially contested concepts, we can better make sense of why woman is still kind of a gender identity. It's just not being treated that way, or that role of the category isn't being prioritized in like the context of that march. So an essentially contested concept is a concept that W.B. Galley introduced in 1955. He says it's a concept that inevitably involves endless disputes about its proper uses on the part of its users. So the conditions that sort of describe, or necessary conditions of these concepts, are that they're evaluative, which means that they're supposed to be considered good or bad. Democracy and art are sort of considered paradigmatic cases. I think you could consider gender categories that way too. While it's not inherently good or bad to be like a woman or a man, for a particular individual, it might be good to be considered a woman and bad to be considered a man, like if they identify with that category. So it is sort of evaluative. It's internally complex, which basically means that there are a variety of descriptive features of the concept that different people take to be the most important in describing why they matter. So for example, with democracy, I might think that democracy is a good thing because it allows more autonomy for the masses or something, while somebody else might think it's a good thing because it respects our individuality, etc. Similarly, with gender, being a woman might matter to someone because they identify with it, but in certain contexts, it might also matter to someone because they're oppressed in a certain way and they need access to resources that are only allocated to women. So there's a variety of reasons being a woman or a man might matter. And then there's this various describability constraint, which is sort of the most important. This one basically suggests that the reason that these concepts are essentially contested is because there's nothing in principle that suggests one reason's person for valuing the concept should matter more than another. That being said, I think that essentially contested concepts can be decontested within context because when we use these concepts in context, we're using them for a reason. There's a reason I make a march women only. There's a reason why I have a women only bathroom, maybe. There's a reason there are women only shelters. And those reasons would probably be preferable or be better reasons for fixing the meaning of the concept than other ones in those contexts of use. So basically, I think that you can understand woman as a context-sensitive, essentially contested concept. The idea is that in certain contexts, or even divorced of context, you could have many different conceptions of woman describe what the concept means. But in particular contexts, our reasons for using it should favor certain conceptions over others. So if you go back to that march, understanding woman as a social class makes more sense in that march. But that doesn't mean that woman, period, is just, not an identity. It can be an identity in other contexts. And generally speaking, it makes sense to understand woman as having a role as an identity. It's just that that role is less salient in a context where we're using it as something connected to like sexual violence in this march. Okay, so I sort of breezed through that because I wanted to leave time for questions. But if you want me to go over something or that was a bit too fast or vague, let me know. But that's basically my presentation. Here are the references.